All right. Hello, everyone. So today I want to talk about, well, you see the title. What do I do if I know that I'm called, but I left church? Is it still possible for me to fulfill what I know God has called me to do? Is it still possible for me to function in the kingdom? Is it still possible for me to do what I know I'm put on earth to do outside of a church setting? So before I get into that, I'll tell you, if you want to connect with me and catch up on some of the projects and events that I have coming up soon, just check out my website, caveofmystery.org. Via my website, you can find everything related, right? So let's answer that question. Is it possible to do your calling outside of church? Absolutely. Right? And here's the biggest reason why. The idea of church that we have today is very much man-made. It's not something that's a part of God's design. In fact, the structure of how we typically do things today, what we recognize as the church today, isn't what they would call, isn't what they recognized in the time period that we're often referencing, right? We look at the Bible and you see in English translations is reference to a church, and upon this rock I will build my church. And there's about, then you get to Revelations, they're talking about the lukewarm church and to this church and to that church, and you have Paul writing to the the Corinthian church, the Roman church, the church of Ephesus, right? And if you look at it from a modern lens, you almost get the idea like Paul is writing these letters to mega churches that everyone just goes to and they fellowship in and they worship once a week. Or that Yeshua, when it says that husbands are to love their wives as Christ loved the church, it gives the idea that Christ is married to what we today call the church. But that's the issue, right? In the original translation, the word used there is ecclesia. Whether you spell it with two K's or two C's, the word remains the same. The word ecclesia means governing body, and it's a governmental term. Remember, I've taught on the governmental aspects of God multiple times. Yeshua didn't really deal in religion, he dealt in government. The function of apostles, that's governmental, right? Well, the ecclesia, or in Hebrew, the kahal, was an assembly of ambassadors. It's the idea that the people within the community, the spiritual leaders in the community, they would gather together and then decide the fate of their region. They would govern over, they would rule over, they would lord over. They were the decision makers, right? It's an assembly of ambassadors, it's an assembly of judges. The ecclesia was meant to be a community of believers, a community of spiritual people, not a building. So let's just say in their day, when they're talking about church, right? For one, they didn't use the word, that came much later, but let's be nice, right? Their idea of church wasn't people gathering once a week to fellowship, worship, and hear their man of God or woman of God preach and possibly minister, possibly pray for them. That wasn't their idea of what we currently call church. Not at all. Not even close. They were people just in the community who were also spirit filled and spirit led, which means that they were able to be a solution in any area of the world that they were already in. So they were doing things like meeting each other in houses, going out into wherever people were. They didn't set up camp and then just invite people to come see them or hear them. No, they met in houses when they did meet in buildings, but for the most part, they were out and about amongst the people. Um, so where did the idea of us doing what we today, well, do? It comes from, let's just say, slight alterations, translations, reconfigurations amongst the text. There came a point where they switched the word ecclesia with the word koinonia, and then put the word church over both of them. So it remains true that the original translation does use ecclesia, but there's a history of the in between where there came a point where they swapped out ecclesia with koinonia and then put the word church over both of them. Well, what's wrong with that? Simple. The word koinonia just means people that gather. It's just a group of people. Now, this makes a lot more sense regarding why what we know as church today doesn't resemble anything like what we read about in the Bible. It's because it's not meant to be. They're two different systems. It's not two ways of doing church. No, 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 no. The standard, see, remember, the thing that Christ is married to is the ecclesia, not the church, not the koinonia. The thing that Paul was writing letters to was not a koinonia, it was an ecclesia. He wasn't writing to just people that gather, he was writing to the governing body of a region, the community of people that lived within an area, writing letters to countries, and all the believers listen to you. That's powerful, right? So it puts it into better perspective as to why they were able to reach their regions in the way that they did. Areas today still marked by things that happened thousands of years ago. But if you look at America, we have all the churches, right? I live in the South. I live in the Bible Belt. There's a church on every block just about, and the world isn't changing. And that enough should be a reason to look and say, okay, something's not right here. Something's being missed. It's not about the assembly or lack of assembly. It's about the effectiveness of the structure and really what's happening with the people, right? It's more about quality that then becomes quantity than it is about just having quantity. Like I said, in the South, we have a ton of churches. We have a bunch of koinonias with the presentation, with the verbiage of an ecclesia. Somebody joins church and they tell them that they joined the kingdom. You set those poor people up for failure. All they did was join your church. They're part of your ministry. That's about it. So if the structure that we have doesn't come from God, where did it come from? Walk with me here. Most of Christianity, the large bulk of it, 80 to 90 to 99% of it, comes from Romans. Not the book of Romans, but Romans, the actual people group. They're the ones who founded the religion. They took historical people, they took movements that were really surging, and then they rebuilt it and reconstructed it in a way that they could still manipulate it. They took Yeshua HaMashiach, who is very much a historical figure, and they used him as the basis for their creation of Jesus Christ, which was meant to be a mascot figure for the religion. Now, the Romans have done stuff like this multiple times with the creation of Serapis Christos, where they take something that's already revered, mix it with something else so they can control two parties at once. This isn't hard. In fact, it's the cult of Serapis Christos where you actually first hear about Christians in the Bible when it says that they were called Christians in Antioch. That wasn't them recognizing them as followers of Jesus Christ. He wasn't known as Jesus Christ. They were being mistaken as the cult of Serapis Christos, which was active in that region and during that time period. Now, during the councils of Nicaea, right, and this is usually when people get irritated, the majority of what is today known as Christianity was constructed. Now, this is where people do very little research because they'll look at a Facebook meme that says that, oh no, they didn't, during the Council of Nicaea, they didn't talk about Jesus, the Trinity, the scriptures, or none of that stuff. That might be true for the first Council of Nicaea, but the Council of Nicaea, as awkward as it's worded, is actually a series of about 7 to 8 different meetings that they had over about a 40-year period. And it was in those meetings. Now, it's funny that the first 7 or the first 6 were called the first Council of Nicaea, and then the very last one was called the second. Weird naming, right? I understand why it gets confusing. But it was during that time period that not only were they creating the structure of Christianity, they were killing off all the people groups who could contest them in the fields, in the streets, in the marketplace. Um, I did a video before, I did a live before, talking about some of the end times things that people are still looking for. Uh, one of them had to do with this persecution, right? This tribulation that people are looking for. And this is actually what led to it historically, as it already happened, by the way, the siege of Jerusalem. But the siege of Jerusalem wasn't the first thing that happened. 2 years before the siege of Jerusalem, there was the Qumran massacre, which was the slaughter of the Essenes. The Essenes are important because that's the actual group of people that Yeshua was a part of. That was his style of Judean mysticism. So they killed them off, and the ones that fled from the massacre found themselves in, let's just say, the more European regions, where instead of going by Essene, they went by Gnostic. The only difference between the Essenes and the Gnostics is the region and the time, before and after the Qumran massacre, for the most part. So this was a very strategic assault by the Romans to get rid of the people who were practicing spirituality and the people who would be able to maintain influence in the area. So the resurgence of Gnostic thought and Essenes isn't necessarily some old deception resurrecting itself. Is actually what was true at a time. Oftentimes, truth kind of moves with the times. Sadly, I personally believe that truth is what it is, but if we're talking about what most people believe, it changes by time period. Now, I'm bringing all this up to paint the picture that the Romans very strategically and very successfully, mind you, eradicated the people who were functioning under the, let's just say, the system that God actually wanted. People meeting in homes, people talking just amongst the community, people being around, people being together. It was the Romans who put together the idea to build an institution, a building, and give it a set time for people to come in and hear about God and be given lectures, messages, sermons, their spiritual experience within their confines. That's when this began, a little under 2,000 years ago. Starting 325 AD, or if you want to start with the massacres, that's 68 AD, but still very recent in history. It's not that old, to be honest. So you have the actual structure of God getting eliminated. So when it talked about the violent taketh by force, it was talking about really what was about to happen to the ecclesia. It was talking about what the Romans were doing to them, or getting ready to do to them. So all to say this, right? Because that's a topic in itself. How can I do my calling if I'm not in church? Well, I think I've done enough. I believe I've said enough for you to see that your calling, your function, wasn't given by God to fit within the confines of something that the Romans created later. Saying that you're called to function within church is like saying that you're called, and the only reason God, your destiny on the earth was to be the manager at Target. It's like, no. So let's get into that, right? Because typically what we see right now is all these gifts, all these functions, all these offices being judged and put under the confines on whether or not they can serve in or work in a local body, and whether or not they can continue to spread the message and the culture of more modern Christianity, or just Christianity in general. And again, that's not what they were doing 2,000 years ago when they started the ecclesias. They were doing quite the opposite of what we do today, which is funny because most pastors, most leaders will preach a sermon along the lines of, oh man, if Paul could see us today, we'd be getting a letter. Oh, if Yeshua was around today, he wouldn't approve of how we're doing things. Yet they continue to do it in a way that they know God's not approving of. So let's start off with the fact that Christianity is ruled by pastors. That's not something you find in the Bible. And even the function of pastor is very different now than what it was then. So I'm going to go through some of the common functions to give y'all a picture of what they actually are and how that can look if you put it back into its proper context. Because again, no one's actually called to church. That's just something that we've done, that we've been doing. You might have encountered God in those settings. You might have started in those settings. I started in those settings. But when it comes down to God's actual will and design, that's not it. You know, it says he'll never leave you nor forsake you. God still worked with us while we were in systems that weren't of his design, simply put. So let's start off with the apostles. What's an apostle? Well, the word apostle means sent one. Now, in church culture today, they'll tell you that an apostle is someone who goes out and they build a bunch of churches. They start a bunch of churches. And it's not. An apostle is not a church planter by modern sense at all. The apostle is one of those borrowed words. It's a governmental term. An apostle within a government, within a kingdom or an empire specifically, was an ambassador sent from that kingdom or that empire in order to either bring the culture or maintain the culture of the country in which they originate from while in a foreign land. Let me say that again, a bit more simplified. The job of the apostle was to go into territory that was, let's just say, yet to be conquered, and they were meant to bring the culture of the kingdom that they come from into the place that they were now in. Or they were sent to a place that had already been conquered to maintain the culture of the kingdom that's now in control. It had nothing to do with, getting a 501c3 and training up people to run the church. You got to get your doctorate of divinity, a doctorate of theology, your religious business degree, and now you know how to run a church. Like, that was not anything close to what they were doing. So if you want to say they were church planners, let's say they were ecclesia planners. They were people who went into regions and their main focus was affecting the culture in one way, shape, or form. But their main focus was to make where they are now look like where they come from. That sounds familiar. On earth, as it is in heaven, is an apostolic mission. The kingdom of heaven. Our apostolic goal as a whole is to make earth look like heaven, in the same way that an apostle of Rome was meant to make a foreign territory look just like Rome, right? A governmental position. So how would an apostle look in modern times? Well, one, that's one of the functions I'm actually called to, that I function in. Main function, well, there's a few different ways that this can manifest because everyone's different. It's just that the end result will be a little bit different, right? The way we go about it is different because we're all different. One of my favorite quotes from, I think it's Apostle Vincent, where he says, if everyone was exactly the same, somebody would be unnecessary. The end result is the changing of a culture. So if you're called by the kingdom into the office of the apostle, the function of the apostle, you want to call it an ascension gift, who cares, right? Your main focus will be making earth look like heaven in one way, shape, or form, at the very least, right? Let's move on to prophets. Well, prophets in today's time are highly persecuted, just like apostles. And it's because they're the rowdy ones. They're the ones that they're the wild card, the loose cannon. And the definition of prophet gets a lot of people in trouble. They usually see prophets as messengers, which I don't agree, but I'll concede for the sake of getting this session going along. But let's just say a prophet very much is just a messenger from God. They're sent to bring that message wherever God sends them to deliver that message, and they're called to say and do whatever they're instructed to say and do with that message, right? That doesn't work within a church setting. Like, remember, most of the churches, confined space, we have an order we're trying to get through. The pastor's in control. You got to get permission before you prophesy, all this stuff, right? The prophet struggles a lot. Real prophets struggle within religious settings for the reason that they're very sensitive. They tend to be very sensitive. We tend to be very sensitive to what God actually wants. So being in a system that's the complete opposite of that is very detrimental. It's chaos. It's a mess waiting to happen, to be honest. So you end up with two things. You either end up with prophets being mistreated or you end up with them being subdued. Oftentimes both, where the prophet has been coached and trained and conditioned in a way that they're okay now with ignoring what they see and hear God do, or see or hear God telling them to do, right? They're fine with disobeying God, or they actually are obeying God and they get labeled rebellious, they get labeled Jezebel, they get labeled all these other terms because they're not moving where the leaders of the ministry want them to go. See how narcissistic the setup is? It's what we want over what God is doing. Yes, we recognize you're a prophet and your function is to be the mouthpiece of God, but you need to submit to us. Weird, right? So if I'm a prophet, how do I do my function outside of a church setting, right? Well, you look in, let's say, we'll stick with the Bible for this one. You look in the Bible, you don't see any prophets functioning in a church system. All your favorite prophets, none of them did. None of them functioned in a church setting. Church settings didn't exist. What you see is them simply being the answer to what needed to be done, them being the outlet, them being the speaker, them being the manifestation that needed to occur at the time. As prophets are sent as messages, it's my actual belief. Prophets are sent as messages from God. The actual prophet is the message, not just the messenger, which means the life that they live is the message they're meant to impart to humanity, to the world. So they're only as effective as they are in the right place that they were meant to be. $1,000 check in the mail at the wrong person's house isn't benefiting the one it was written for. So America or many other nations are struggling not because of a lack of prophets, but prophets being trapped in a setting, being conditioned, coached, taught, and trained to not go and be what they were sent here to be or go where they were meant to go. So if you're a prophet, the best thing for you to do is step back for a moment, reconnect with God, find out where was I sent and what is the message that I'm meant to impart overall, right? The job of a prophet isn't to walk around and prophesy to everybody. It's not to have a word for everybody. No, not really. A lot of the prophets that you read about in the Old Testament, they prophesy one time and that was it. They'd prophesy to the nation and then that was it. They'd prophesy to a person and then that was it, right? They weren't prophesying to everybody. You don't have to prove that you're a real prophet by prophesying. We find out how often that doesn't matter. So that's apostles, that's prophets. Next, let's go to pastors, right? Pastors, that's one I've brought up a lot. What if I know I heard God tell me I'm a pastor? Because that's what matters most with any of these functions. You can't self-commission, nor can someone else give you a function. I can't train you from nobody and make you a prophet. I can't take you from nothing and make you a pastor. That's incorrect. That's out of order. It's Elohim that gives the gifts and the functions. It's God that does the calling. So I can't make you something you're not called to be. So when it comes to pastors, right, you'll hear a lot of warnings about watch out for false apostles, watch out for false prophets. I agree with that. The issue is that no one watches out for false pastors, and we have more of that than anything. Most pastors don't believe that you, for one, can even hear from God. Two, they've never heard God themselves. So where did they get their calling from? Most pastors got their stepped into the role from two paths. Most of them. Either they went to school, they got their seminary degree and then opened up their church, or they were churchy, they grew up as a kid, they really wanted to do it, and eventually they were given the position just because how dedicated they were within Christianity. Well, the way that pastors are typically presented today, the function is presented as the master of the church building, the lord of the local church. That's not really what they're called to do. The word pastor is the word shepherd. Well, what does a shepherd do? They take care of the sheep, they nurture and they protect. That's actually what pastors are called to do. Pastors, as much as y'all don't want to hear this, are closer in function to motivational speakers and counselors than anything, right? And that's been a sermon for forever. Oh, you just a motivational speaker. Oh, you just counselor. No, well, that's actually what pastoring looks like. Because the idea of the pastor wasn't someone who leads over the local assembly. No, the pastor was a shepherd in the midst of the people that people could come to if they needed help. If you needed counseling, if you needed motivation, if you needed comfort, you would find yourself a pastor within your region, and that was their function, right? The pastor wasn't the person who took in the tithe. They weren't the person that ran the local assembly. None of that's real, right? That isn't how they function. So if you know you're called to be a pastor, you're like, no, no, no. God told me that I'm called to be a pastor. Well, let's look at what pastors should be doing. Like, I believe that all the training you need can come from God. But let's say you're going to school because you want to be good at being a pastor. You don't need the seminary degree. You don't need the doctorate of theology. You don't need the doctorate of divinity. That's not the schooling you need. If you're going to school, right? You need counseling. You need psychology. Though therapy, those are the type of things that you want to go get training in because that's more in line with the actual function you're called to do. Someone being called to be a pastor means I'm someone who's called to be able to handle people's problems when they need help at any moment of the day. Pastors in function are what people assume priests are. And that doesn't require a church setting at all. Remember, this isn't about trying to set up a ministry hub or a ministry network. You're already in your environment. You're already in your own city. If you're called to be a pastor, you just represent yourself, relaunch yourself into the region. Hey, if you need help, come here. Hey, this is my number. This is how you get in contact with me. Go to my website. If you need help, come find me. That's what pastors actually look like. It's not some guy sweating his hair out, hollering into a mic, doing runs. It's not, no, that's stuff that we grew up with. It's fun. I grew up Baptist, right? I experienced Pentecostal. I experienced Kojic. I experienced almost all the denominations, right? The ones in America. I've seen it all. That's not what pastors are called to do. They're called to be a resource of comfort within their region. As people pass by. Now, remember, all of these functions are for the equipping of the saints. So you might be coming into meeting people who are unbelievers, or believers, but it's nurture is the function for pastors. So I'll tell you this. This is something I said years ago, back when I understood this. I'm like, the only way a church building type setting would work is based on how many people realistically one person can actually nurture and cater to. You have a church, thousands of people attend. Do thousands of people have the pastor's phone number and they could call on them at any moment? They can't. They're not being pastored. Something that I would say back then, before I understood the system itself was the problem, was that, well, you should have 30, 40, 50 pastors in a church, depending on how many people are in it. Because the actual function is shepherding. If you can't get a hold of your pastor when you need help, you're being taken advantage of. They're not doing a good job. If you need help from the pastor and they send you a deacon or an associate minister, why is the pastor there? If we're going by the structure and the vocabulary, right? So that's pastors, right? I don't want to talk about that too much. Next, let's go to evangelists. Today, evangelists are seen as two things: itinerant ministers and people who go out to bring people to church. No. The role of the evangelist is not to bring people to church, nor is it just the title you take on when you decide to travel and do ministry. An evangelist is kind of like a walking ad for the kingdom. Their job is to bring people into the kingdom, connect people back with the royal family of God, restart and initiate people's relationship with God, giving people a reason to trust God, giving people a reason to give God a chance, bringing people into a kingdom identity, a kingdom function. That's more in line with the function of an evangelist. So no, the evangelist isn't some older lady coming up, knocking on doors saying, hey, we doing a revival down at the church. We'd love for y'all to come. And then if the people come and then people join church, they've done their job. No. Evangelists do their job wherever they are. Can't actually cut off your job as an evangelist. That means that the major, because I'm assuming God called you to this function, right? Right. Remember, that's the standard. That's the important thing, is that God told you that this is what you're supposed to be doing. So if this is your calling, this is your life. You can't cut any of this stuff off. This means that everywhere you go, anytime you're in public, your major focus is on, how can I get more people to embrace their kingdom identity? What can be done? That's the consciousness that you're in. Now, the manifestation of that looks different depending on the person. Some people might do it through music. Some people might be in Walmart every day looking for new people to pray for, minister to, talk to. Some people, it's just they'll be at work. Some people might walk the streets. I'll tell you what, it's not. Evangelism is not standing on the corner yelling at strangers, telling them that they're going to hell. That's not evangelism. That's abuse. Now, the next one, we have teachers. Well, what's the function of teachers? No one talks about teachers, but that's an easy function. Teachers are teachers. Their job is to educate and revelate. The issue is the education and revelation is stuck under the boundary of Christianity, the bylaws, the structure, the doctrines of the church. The teacher is a revelator. It's someone who's able to deliver the truth and help bring people up, right? Typically, revelators are only accredited to apostles and prophets, to the point where I've had people tell me one of the reasons they believe that I'm apostle is because of how well I teach. And I'm like, well, no, that's because I'm a good teacher. The apostolic helps, the prophetic helps with that. But the actual function of the teacher very much well is teaching. They're supposed to know the things of God and be able to teach people how to walk in those things. it's not a desired gift because in modern church culture, teachers don't get any respect. They get Sunday school. And even in Sunday school, they just got the little pamphlet that they going through, and that's about it. A group discussion leader is about all you get out of teachers these days within the kingdom structure, within a religious context. So in every other arena, teacher means teacher. You get into church culture, and then teacher is reciter. They're not teaching anymore. No, teachers are very much important. One of the most important. You go to Corinthians, Paul told them directly, "I'll need apostles, prophets, and teachers." So teachers are very much important. Notice he didn't tell them they needed pastors. But that's all that's going on with the teachers. So there is your apostle, your prophet, your pastor, your teacher, your evangelist, right? Those are the five main functions that you hear the most contention about. They call it the fivefold. This is how it actually works. Now, there are other functions, there are other gifts, there are other manifestations that fit within a kingdom structure, that fit within an imperial structure. I might do another session on that another time, but if you haven't already, check out my book because I do talk about a lot of the gifts and functions in there. Fullness Guide to Sonship and Mysticism, available Amazon, Kindle, Barnes and Noble, and Audible. You can get the audiobook too. I talk about many of the different roles and functions, offices, and things like that, just to give you some definitions. Now, if you're called to it, you're called to it. Yes, you can walk in multiple functions at the same time. You're not arrogant if God calls you. You're not in pride because you walk in two gifts. Yeah. So there's this thing people have been saying, oh, everybody's an apostle these days. Everybody is a prophet these days. There's no smoke for pastors that you can just get the degree for. Truthfully, there's more people that are authentic prophets and authentic there's more authentic people out there. It's just all the authentic people aren't given respect. They're not given the platform. They move against the grain. Either they've compromised to fit in with the system, or they've been completely outcasted by the system. So oftentimes you'll find people authentically called to certain functions in a culture that Christianity would deem demonized altogether. They'd call them witches. Like some people who get labeled psychics and witches very much are just prophets that the church didn't want. John Paul Jackson has one of my favorite quotes about this, where people left because they found that the church was unresponsive to their experiences. Other cultures will honor you more than you'll be honored in a church setting. That's because church is one of the least spiritual places you can be. Largest religion, but religion isn't always spiritual, right? You don't actually have to be spiritual to be religious. Most of your pastors are atheists. Most of your leaders are atheists. They don't believe in God. They don't believe that you can interact with God. They don't believe that. I'm not just saying that to be somewhat sadistic. I'm saying this because I've talked to so many pastors over the last several years. Many of them do not believe that you can hear from God directly. Many of them have never heard from God directly. So at their best, a lot of your church leaders are giving you their best. What about deacons? What about bishops, right? What about elders? Let's talk about those. Do bishops exist? Kind of, sort of. The word bishop comes from the word presbytery. Presbytery talks about priests. So they're really just talking about priests. What we have today is some buffoonery. It's not about wearing a big hat, having nice rings, and I love jewelry myself. Y'all see my rings in other videos. I don't have them all. What we call bishops and archbishops today, that has nothing to do with kingdom function. In religious culture, the bishop is the person that governs over many pastors, aka many different church buildings. The archbishop leads over many bishops. Yeah, but no. That's not real, right? No one's called to be a bishop. Even in the Bible, it says, if anyone desires, and again, they're talking about the priesthood. They're not talking about what we have today that calls themselves bishops, something different entirely. What about deacons? Deacons were very similar. Deacons were more so, let's see, how do I want to put this? So the word deacon, for the most part, just means servant. And it's just talking about someone that's available to help in the area that they can help in. Right. Now, understand the prerequisite of being a deacon wasn't kissing up to the pastor. The prerequisite for being a deacon was that they had to be overflowing in the Spirit of God, overflowing in the power of the Holy Ghost. That was the prerequisite, right? And they list some of those things. They were very much helpful. So in a lot of church settings, the deacon is probably the only one that's closer to what they're supposed to be. It's just that the standard for deaconship is much lower now than it was back then. If you were a deacon back then and you couldn't heal the sick, cast out devils, or raise the dead, you weren't a deacon. Nowadays, the deacon is just the guy that opens up church with prayer and leads everybody in the benediction, and they might bring the table and the buckets out for tithes and offering, stuff like that. They're the person you talk to when the pastor don't want to talk to nobody. Weird, but what about elders? So elders, right? Another overlapping term. An elder was pretty much the same as a master. The elder was not a term related to age in any capacity. It was related to mastery. An elder was someone who knew what they were doing in a field of expertise. So when it says, if any among you is sick, let him call for the elders. That means call for the people who know how to do this. Call for the people. Again, it had nothing to do with age. You could be an elder at 15, 12 if you knew what you were doing. It was about mastering the skill, mastering the craft, mastering the ability. It's a term of mastery. So understand this. None of your functions, none of your callings were meant for a church setting. They are meant for the kingdom. There is a function. You do have use. It just doesn't necessarily look like what you might have thought it was supposed to look like. So that's about all for today I wanted to cover. But yes, you do not have to function in a church in order to be called, nor, and let me speak to this, nor is your calling proofed by how well you've served other people's vision. That's just some nonsense that people have started today because they want you to do chores. No, you don't have to prove that you're anointed by helping set up the chairs and scrubbing toilets, and you got to show up every Sunday. You can't have a week off, nothing like that. You got to do whatever they tell you to. That's not how you prove that you're called. They're lying to y'all. They just want you to clean the toilet. They just want you to help set up chairs, and they're lying about it. Yeah. Whether or not you serve in a local church, that does not matter. More than likely, the local church is taking up all your time and effort so that you never go out and help the world. The world doesn't benefit, but at least your pastor likes you. Hey, I'd rather be disliked by all of y'all favorite pastors, knowing I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing in the kingdom. More people need to make that stance. I will do what I know I'm called to do at anyone's expense. It comes back to a place of intimacy. You have to spend time actually knowing God. You have to be familiar hearing God. In the Bible, no one's ever confused on whether or not somebody can hear God. Shows you where the standard was. When a person heard God back then, they heard God, they obeyed God, or they didn't obey God, but they never struggled to hear. In today's time, we have weird things where people are like, yeah, I saw the number 1111 on the clock, and I saw 4 blue vans drive past me. God must be speaking to me. That's not what they were doing. They heard. Just as you're hearing me now, they heard God then. Everyone can hear God to the same capacity. It's a practice of listening. Now, if you're already on my channel, Go to my playlist. I have a playlist called Sonship and Mysticism Basics. I talk about hearing God. I talk about practicing the presence. Those are the things that you need to start off your kingdom journey. Those are the simple things. There are more outrageous things out there. But yeah, again, check out my book if you haven't already. But I definitely wanted to speak to that idea. No, you don't have to prove yourself to the leader. No one needs to release you to go and do what you heard God tell you to do. If God is telling you to do something, you do whatever that is. When Elohim speaks, listen to them. That's it. A leader that has a problem with that is an atheist, is an abuser, is manipulative. They're in your way. They are robbing you, not just of your money, but they're robbing you of your destiny if you have to go through them to obey God. Can we let it be that simple? You go hear God. Once you hear God, you obey God. That's it. Let's say it another way. Don't do before you hear. Do what you hear. Do what you're told to do. By your pastor? No, by God. Well, what about the checks and balances? What about the leadership? Right? I believe in godly leadership. What about Timothy and Paul? What about Elijah and Elijah? What about Moses and Joshua? What about Yeshua and his disciples? Are supposed to go out and make disciples. I agree. But that's not a lording over a person. Even Yeshua got to a point where he said, I no longer call you servants, I call you friends. That means we're equal. And at no point did he present those gifts and functions as hierarchies over one another. It's checks and balances. We check each other. We're part of the same government. The apostle isn't over everybody, then the prophet. No, it doesn't work that way. Trying to fit those functions into a hierarchy destroys them and destroys the people that you're supposed to be edifying, because it gives the idea that some people are more important than others. Well, what about spiritual rank? Well, spiritual rank just has to do with how secure in their authority in the spirit a person is, and that has nothing to do with a function, because there are people who aren't called to any of the 5 functions that I mentioned earlier who walk in more authority than a lot of people who carry them. So whether or not you have a specific calling, that doesn't in any way affect whether or not you can do kingdom work. And that's kind of why you could say that the culture that we're familiar with is Jezebelic by nature. The name Jezebel means unappointed. So when we talk about the spirit of Jezebel, we're not talking about a lady, a woman that's not listening to you, a woman that won't submit. We're not talking about a woman not wearing a dress. We're not talking about that. The spirit of Jezebel is the spirit of being unappointed. So it's the manifestation of that is being in a function you're not called to be in, or trying to get into a position you know you're not called to. That's Jezebelic, and Christianity by structure is very much that. People in functions God never called them to be in, forcing people to submit to them in a place that God didn't put them in. Jezebel. Which means that they'll often clash with people who are actually called, because there's the actual calling fighting against somebody, or fighting against a system, fighting against a committee that didn't get their calling from God. They got given a calling. They desired a calling. But at the very least, remember this: there is no hierarchy in that capacity. It goes back to eldership. Either you know what you're doing and you're able to replicate yourself, or you can't. And that isn't indicative of apostle, prophet, teacher. It's not about any of that. Nor do you need to be under somebody. I believe in accountability, but that's horizontal. If y'all think I'm messing up, anyone can tell me, hey, Nelson, we think you messing up. Like, you don't have to be over me. I don't have to submit myself under you. We're submitted to each other. We're all family, brothers and sisters within the family of Elohim. We're in the ecclesia. I don't need to be under you. You don't need to be under me. It's not that type of system. That's America and that's Rome in y'all head. Um, so yeah, I believe I got my point across. Yeah, let me know what y'all think in the comments down below. Let's keep the conversation going. Now, I will tell y'all I have a few events coming up that y'all might want to participate in. I have a healer course. Let's see. All right, so I have a healer course. For those of you interested, you want to learn how to heal the sick. You're tired of feeling powerless. You're tired of being helpless in situations that require healing. Um, all right, so yeah, if you want to learn how to heal the sick, you want to learn how to never be sick again. You want to learn all of that stuff. Join the class. It'll be in January. Also in January, we're doing a healing meeting. Let me pull that one up. All right. So January 18th, the third weekend in January, we're doing a healing meeting in Humble, Texas, Houston. For those of you who want to travel, come see us in person. Yeah, this isn't a church service. This is a meeting. We're just going to be healing, casting out demons, doing impartation. So if you have an issue you want solved, you need healing, you need breakthrough, or you just want to be empowered, you want prayer, show up. Free resource. We're not going to take up an offering or anything. Come with needs. We're here to help. And last but not least, I have another meeting that we're going to be doing. My anniversary, Cave of Mysteries anniversary celebration, June 21st. We're going to be in Houston, Texas. I'll be joined by some of my friends, Apostle Vincent Poole, Apostle Andre Pfizer, Prophet Jaworski Gardner, and Apostle Kimberly Jackson Jones. So if you're interested, you want to come be with us, celebrate with us. It's going to be a day of revelation, impartation, demonstration, not something that you want to miss. All right. So with that being said, that's all I got for y'all today. Updates and everything else will be on my website, caveofmystery.org. From there, you can find everything that I have to offer. Until next time, y'all be blessed. Later.